Welcome to Explain Movie. This is the place where we take films apart and put them back together in a way that actually makes sense. Walking through the key scenes, the characters who drive them, the twists that catch you off guard, and the small details that give each story its own personality. If you're the kind of person who loves movies but also loves digging into what makes them tick, you've landed in the right spot. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's get into it. Spartacus, 1960, cast, craft, themes, and legacy. By the time he signed on for Spartacus, Laurence Olivier had already built an international reputation for his commanding voice, precise technique, and cerebral approach to acting. As Crassus, he delivers something cold, aristocratic, and tightly controlled, a portrait of the Roman elite's ideological resistance to the slave uprising. The part gave Olivier a chance to explore a different flavor of villainy, one built not on chaos but on calculated authority. Spartacus also added a new dimension to his career simply by putting him inside a sprawling Hollywood epic, where his theatrical instincts stood in sharp contrast to the more grounded, naturalistic acting happening around him. Simmons takes on the role of Verinia, a largely fictionalized enslaved woman who becomes Spartacus's partner and emotional center. Simmons had already proven herself a versatile performer across British and American film, with standout turns in Hamlet, 1948, Guys and Dolls, 1955, and Elmer's Gantry, 1960. She arrived at Spartacus right as her career was shifting toward more mature, emotionally layered roles, and as Verinia she brings warmth, dignity, and a steadying presence to a story otherwise dominated by violence and political maneuvering. Though Spartacus is often remembered for its male-driven conflict, Simmons' work supplies the film's human anchor, and it helped cement her reputation as an actress who could pair inner strength with genuine sensitivity. Tony Curtis plays Antoninus, a young slave who grows close to Spartacus over the course of the story. At the time, Curtis was already among Hollywood's biggest leading men, admired for his looks and his range. He'd shown real dramatic chops in Sweet Smell of Success, 1957, and comic brilliance in Some Like It Hot, 1959. Casting him in Spartacus raised eyebrows in some circles, with critics wondering whether he could hold his own opposite heavyweights like Olivier and Douglas in a serious historical epic. He answered those doubts with a performance more nuanced than expected, especially in his emotionally charged scenes with both Spartacus and Crassus. The role pushed his range further and helped nudge his public image away from romantic comedy and toward more dramatic territory. Peter Ustinov, cast as Lentulus Basiatus, the gladiator trainer who first owned Spartacus, was already a celebrated actor, writer, and filmmaker by 1960, known for his sharp intelligence, wit, and adaptability across mediums. His work in Spartacus stands as one of the film's most memorable performances, mixing comedy, cynicism, and moral ambiguity into a character who's neither villain nor hero, just a man trying to survive inside a corrupt system. That performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, boosting his international profile and confirming his place among cinema's finest character actors. John Gavin appears as Julius Caesar, a historically thin, somewhat simplified take on the real figure, but a notable role nonetheless for an actor on the rise. Known for his striking looks and polished screen presence, Gavin would go on to appear in Psycho, 1960, and Spartacus helped make him a familiar face in Hollywood's epic productions. Even though his character wasn't central to the plot, sharing the screen with such a stacked ensemble gave real momentum to his early 1960s career. Charles Laughton, playing the Roman senator Sempronius Gracchus, Crassus's political rival, was already a towering figure in film history, an Academy Award winner for The Private Life of Henry VIII, 1933, and Unforgettable in Mutiny on the Bounty, 1935, and Witness for the Prosecution, 1957. In Spartacus, he brings his signature blend of wit, gravity, and quiet irony to a character who serves as a political counterweight to Crassus. deepening the film's portrayal of infighting within the Roman Senate. This was one of Laughton's final major screen roles, and it reinforced his standing as one of classical Hollywood's most distinguished actors. A cultural landmark, Spartacus is widely considered one of the most culturally significant historical epics Hollywood has ever produced. Its influence reaches well beyond the theater. It has shaped political conversation, colored how audiences think about rebellion and freedom, and left a permanent mark on film, literature, and popular culture more broadly. Unlike most sword and sandal pictures of its era, it became a genuine symbol of resistance against oppression, turning it into both a landmark film and an enduring cultural touchstone. One of the film's most important legacies is its tie to political freedom and civil rights. A story about an enslaved man leading a mass revolt against a mighty empire naturally invites comparisons to real struggles against injustice. When the film hit theaters in the early 1960s, much of the world was grappling with political unrest, civil rights battles, and larger debates over equality and freedom. So audiences didn't just see Spartacus as ancient history, but as a mirror held up to their own moment. Spartacus's refusal to bow to Roman authority became a lasting metaphor for personal dignity and collective defiance. The scene where captured slaves rise, one after another, to declare "I am Spartacus" ranks among the most iconic moments in film history. It elevated the character from a historical figure into a universal emblem of solidarity, a proof that identity and humanity can't be stripped away by ownership or oppression. That single scene has since echoed through political speeches, protest movements, and cultural commentary as shorthand for unity in the face of injustice, and it's been referenced and parodied so often in TV, film, and online culture that it's practically embedded in the collective consciousness. The film also reshaped how Hollywood approached the epic genre itself. Before Spartacus, historical epics leaned heavily on spectacle and heroic myth-making without much interest in political or social substance. Spartacus introduced a more serious tone, weaving large-scale action together with ideology, class struggle, and questions of human rights, clearing a path for later films like Laurence of Arabia, Gladiator, and Braveheart to blend spectacle with genuine political commentary. It proved that audiences would sit through long, dense narratives carrying real philosophical weight. Then there's the film's connection to the Hollywood blacklist. The screenplay came from Dalton Trumbo, who had been blacklisted through the late 1940s and 1950s during the McCarthy-era anti-communist purges and had spent years writing under pseudonyms. Spartacus became one of the first major studio films to credit him openly, under his own name, a decision Kirk Douglas fought hard to make happen. That choice marked a genuine turning point in Hollywood, helping dismantle the blacklist system piece by piece. Because of it, Spartacus isn't remembered only as a movie but as a political statement about artistic freedom and standing up to censorship. The film's symbolism extends further into how we think about leadership and rebellion. Rather than a conquering hero, Spartacus is portrayed as a reluctant leader who becomes a stand-in for collective struggle, a framing that influenced how later films and shows depicted revolutionary figures, favoring moral complexity and human vulnerability over easy heroics. It helped redefine what a screen hero could look like, trading invincible warriors for grounded, emotionally real leaders. Internationally, audiences in countries dealing with political unrest or post-colonial transitions read Spartacus as a story of liberation, an allegory for pushing back against imperialism and authoritarian rule. Its depiction of a mass uprising against a dominant empire struck a chord in societies with their own histories of colonialism and independence struggles, which is part of why the film's relevance has traveled so well across cultures and decades. Its imagery and its central line have turned up everywhere, from comedy sketches to political commentary, sports culture, and advertising, and I Am Spartacus has practically become everyday shorthand for collective identity and shared sacrifice. Even political leaders and activists have invoked the story, formally or informally, when talking about solidarity in the face of oppression. The film also stoked lasting public curiosity about ancient Rome. Despite taking real liberties with historical accuracy, it sparked interest in the Roman Republic, systems of slavery, and gladiatorial combat that carried over into education, literature, and later screen productions. And its visual take on the ancient world became one of the defining cinematic images of Rome. On top of that, the film's scale and seriousness raised the status of the historical epic as a genre, proving that these films could be more than escapist spectacle and could genuinely wrestle with moral and political ideas, helping legitimize large-scale historical filmmaking as serious art rather than pure commercial product. In the decades since, Spartacus has grown into something bigger than a movie, a reference point for conversations about freedom, identity, and resistance that shows up across political discourse, film scholarship, and pop culture alike. Few films have managed to fuse historical storytelling with this kind of staying power. Behind the scenes, a turbulent production making Spartacus was one of the most ambitious, difficult, and historically consequential undertakings in Hollywood's history. Behind its polished final cut lies a story full of creative clashes, political risk, technical hurdles, and decisions that ended up reshaping the industry itself. This wasn't just a film being made, it was a battleground over authorship, creative control, and the direction studio filmmaking would take. Stanley Kubrick directed the film while still fairly early in his career and still building his reputation. He'd already shown his precision, visual intelligence, and fascination with moral conflict in Paths of Glory, 1957, but Spartacus was an entirely different animal, a massive Universal-financed studio production with a huge budget, an enormous cast, and rigid expectations. Kubrick stepped in after the original director, Anthony Mann, was let go early in the shoot following disputes with Kirk Douglas over the film's creative direction. That abrupt change in leadership set a tense tone from the very start. One of the defining behind-the-scenes stories of Spartacus is the friction between Kubrick and Kirk Douglas. Douglas, both the film's star and one of its producers, wielded significant influence over the production, while Kubrick, younger and less established, was already known for his obsessive control and independent artistic vision. Their partnership was marked by disagreements over performance, pacing, and who ultimately called the shots. Douglas favored a more conventional Hollywood approach. Kubrick pushed towards realism, restraint, and psychological depth. The clashes were real, but they also contributed to the finished film's complexity. Both men kept pushing forward despite the friction, and the result reflects a fusion of their competing visions. Trumbo's screenplay represents another major milestone in the film's production story. Blacklisted for his political beliefs during the McCarthy era, Trumbo had spent years writing under other names or through go-betweens. Spartacus became one of the first big studio films to credit him openly, a decision strongly backed by Douglas that quietly but powerfully challenged the blacklist system. It was a genuinely risky move at the time, one that could have damaged careers and studio relationships, but it ended up marking a turning point that helped bring the blacklist era to an end. The shoot itself was a logistical monster. It called for thousands of extras, massive battle sequences, and elaborate sets built to recreate ancient Rome and its surrounding landscapes. Much of the filming took place outdoors in California and Spain, chosen for terrain that could pass for the ancient Mediterranean. The opening quarry sequence, where Spartacus and other slaves endure brutal forced labor, demanded tight coordination of large groups of performers along with practical effects to simulate dangerous working conditions safely. The large-scale battles between the rebel slave army and Roman legions posed some of the toughest production challenges of all. These scenes required intricate choreography, careful management of stunt performers, and control over huge crowds. And with no digital effects to fall back on, everything had to be staged physically, often across multiple cameras and countless takes under unpredictable weather and lighting. Keeping continuity and realism intact across scenes of that scale was a constant headache for the production team. Kubrick's directing style on set was famously methodical. He'd demand take after take to nail the emotional and visual result he wanted, which sometimes frustrated cast and crew used to a faster pace. But that obsessive attention to detail is exactly what gives the film its polished visuals and emotional clarity, and it shows especially in how he frames characters within massive architectural spaces to underline themes of power and oppression. The scale of the set design presented its own enormous challenge. Entire Roman environments, say arenas, training grounds, villas, political chambers, they had to be built not just for realism but to visually reflect Roman society's social hierarchy. Distinguishing the spaces occupied by enslaved people from the spaces occupied by Roman elites took careful coordination among production designers, cinematographers, and the director. Weather, scheduling, and resource management added more physical strain to the shoot. Outdoor scenes were frequently delayed by lighting conditions or environmental factors, and organizing thousands of extras for battle scenes required precision that resembled a military operation more than a film shoot. Costumes, props, and weapons all had to be tracked and duplicated carefully to keep continuity across the many days of filming. Skilled technical departments also played a crucial role behind the scenes. Cinematography had to adapt constantly, moving between intimate interior palace scenes and sprawling outdoor battlefields, each demanding different lighting approaches. Sound recording faced its own struggles in these vast, open environments, often requiring the crew to lean on post-production dubbing and sound design to keep dialogue clear. And with the sheer volume of footage generated during the shoot, editing became critical to the film's success. The editors had to balance intimate character beats against sweeping action sequences without losing the story's emotional center. One of the quieter but no less important challenges was walking the line between historical authenticity and effective cinematic storytelling. How the story is built. Spartacus tells a sweeping story that fuses personal struggle with a large-scale political uprising, gradually widening its scope from individual oppression to a full-blown revolution against the Roman Republic. The pacing is deliberate. How the film opens with confinement and humiliation and closes with a massive clash between the rebels and Roman authority, following a classical epic arc while staying carefully attuned to emotional progression and rising ideological stakes. The story begins in a brutal Roman quarry, where enslaved laborers are worked to exhaustion. From the opening scenes, the film establishes a world defined by imbalance and dehumanization. Spartacus, at this point just one more enslaved man among many, is introduced as quiet, watchful, and physically powerful, defined not by ambition but by sheer endurance. This early stretch functions as exposition, sure, but it's also thematic groundwork, immersing the viewer in a system of oppression that feels both intimate and structural. The story shifts gears once Spartacus is purchased and sent to Lentulus Spatiatus's gladiator school, the first major turning point in the film's structure. The school becomes a microcosm of Roman society, a place where enslaved fighters are trained to entertain the ruling class through violence. Inside it, Spartacus begins forming relationships, studying the mechanics of power around him, and slowly emerging as a figure of moral clarity. The pacing becomes more character-driven here, dwelling on interactions, rivalries, and the instinct to survive. A pivotal moment arrives when the cruelty of the overseers and the sheer brutality of the gladiator system push Spartacus toward rebellion. Crucially, the film doesn't frame his rise as sudden or miraculous. It builds gradually, showing how repeated injustice hardens into collective resistance. That slow build matters, because it lets the audience understand rebellion not as some abstract concept but as the almost inevitable response to sustained cruelty. The story's true hinge point comes when Spartacus and the other gladiators rise up and break free, a moment that shifts the narrative from a confined space into open rebellion. The film's scope expands dramatically here, both geographically and thematically, What started as a survival story inside a controlled environment becomes a movement threatening an entire political order. The prison break isn't just a physical escape, it's the pivot from small-scale conflict to full-blown revolution. Once free, Spartacus takes command of a growing slave army, and this section of the film is built around expansion and momentum. Enslaved people from all over join the cause, swelling the rebellion's ranks and confidence. The story takes on a road movie quality as the rebel army sweeps across the countryside, liberating others as it goes, each encounter reinforcing the theme of collective freedom. Spartacus himself shifts from reluctant fighter to symbolic figurehead, even as he keeps resisting the notion of personal authority. A key relationship develops between Spartacus and Verinia here, adding a parallel emotional through-line to the larger political story. Their bond gives the audience personal stakes amid the rebellion's growing scale, and it's woven into the main plot rather than kept separate, reinforcing the idea that personal and political freedom are deeply intertwined. As the rebellion grows, so does Rome's response, becoming more organized and more severe, and the story shifts again toward a sense of mounting inevitability. Roman political figures argue over how to handle the uprising while military forces close in on the rebels. This stretch builds tension through strategic maneuvering rather than direct combat, with a more deliberate pace that emphasizes the pressure closing in on Spartacus and his followers. Around the midpoint of this final stretch, cracks start showing within the rebel ranks. Disagreements over strategy, ideology, and personal ambition surface as some want to fight harder, others look for a way out or a compromise. This internal friction adds real texture to the story, showing that revolutions aren't unified blocks but fragile coalitions of people with different motives. The climactic battle between Spartacus's army and the Roman forces is where the story's structure comes to a head, not just a physical fight but a symbolic one, pitting slavery against authority and freedom against control. The pacing tightens into a focused sequence of action and emotional payoff. The rebels fight bravely but are ultimately crushed by Rome's superior organization and resources, a defeat framed not as a failure of spirit but as the inevitable result of structural imbalance. One of the film's most important beats comes after the battle, when captured slaves are offered freedom in exchange for identifying Spartacus. That's the setup for the famous I Am Spartacus sequence, where one man after another claims the name rather than betray him. It's the emotional and thematic peak of the entire film, where the story resolves not through military victory but through solidarity and shared identity, shifting from external conflict to a triumph that's entirely moral and internal. The final stretch deals with the rebellion's aftermath. Spartacus is captured and executed, but the film refuses to treat that as simple defeat. Instead, it frames his legacy as something that outlives his physical death. Verinia and their child stand in for continuity and hope, suggesting the ideas behind the uprising survive even after the uprising itself is crushed. Structurally, Spartacus follows a familiar arc: oppression, awakening, rebellion, expansion, confrontation, aftermath. But what sets it apart is how much emotional and ideological weight each stage carries. The story isn't driven purely by plot events but by the evolving consciousness of individuals and the group as a whole. Themes and symbolism. Spartacus isn't just a historical epic, it's a deeply thematic film that uses ancient Roman rebellion as a lens for exploring universal questions about freedom, oppression, identity, power, and human dignity. Underneath the battles and political scheming, the film is layered with symbolism that turns a historical story into a broader meditation on life under systems of control. Freedom versus slavery sits at the center of it all, and not just literally. The film treats it as a philosophical and psychological condition too. The enslaved characters are legally owned by Rome, but the film keeps circling back to the idea that slavery is also a state of mind. Early on, Spartacus is defined by survival rather than self-determination. As his awareness of injustice deepens, his journey becomes a shift from passive endurance to active resistance. Freedom, in this telling, isn't just breaking free of chains, it's asserting personal and collective identity. Tied closely to that is the theme of systemic oppression. Rome isn't just a political power in this story, it's a structure built on hierarchy, exploitation, and control, with the gladiator school, the Senate, and the military each representing a different layer of the same machine. Together, they form a network of dominance that feels nearly unbreakable. Rome, symbolically, stands in for any system that reduces people to tools or property, and the film is careful to frame oppression not as the product of individual cruelty but as something sustained by tradition, law, and economic self-interest. Identity and collective humanity form another central theme. One of the film's most powerful ideas is that individual identity can dissolve into something shared when people face a common struggle, expressed most clearly in the finale, where character after character declares, "I am Spartacus." That moment transforms Spartacus from one man into a symbol claimed by many, suggesting identity isn't fixed or owned but something that can be chosen, shared, and reshaped through solidarity. Spartacus becomes less a person than an idea, resistance itself. Power and corruption form a further thematic layer. Crassus and the Roman elite represent power that's rational, composed, and utterly self-assured, a structured, legal, institutionalized power rather than chaotic violence, which the film suggests is actually more dangerous, because it justifies itself as order and civilization. Crassus doesn't see himself as cruel, he sees himself as preserving stability. That framing raises real questions about how systems of authority define morality in ways designed to protect themselves from challenge. The film also probes human dignity under extreme pressure. Even enslaved, its characters hold on to personal honor, emotional connection, and moral agency. Spartacus's refusal to submit, even facing certain defeat, becomes a statement that dignity exists independent of winning, that it's an internal condition capable of surviving even the harshest oppression. Love and human connection add another symbolic thread, mainly through Spartacus and Varinia's relationship, which represents a form of connection that exists outside systems of ownership and control. In a world defined by domination, their bond stands for emotional freedom. Varinia isn't a passive figure here, she shares fully in the moral and emotional arc of the resistance, and their relationship hints at continuity and hope beyond destruction, especially by the film's end. Leadership, too, gets a symbolic treatment. Spartacus isn't shown as a mythic conqueror or a divinely ordained leader. His authority emerges organically from circumstance and collective need, challenging the notion that leadership must be imposed from above. In the film's framework, real leadership isn't about domination but about representing a shared struggle. Spartacus becomes a leader because others recognize their own longing for freedom reflected in him. There's also a subtle current of religious and mythic symbolism. The film often frames Spartacus in ways that echo classical hero myths, but it deliberately resists making him superhuman, keeping the story grounded in human experience. That tension between myth and realism is itself meaningful. It suggests historical figures become legendary not because they're extraordinary in themselves, but because their struggles speak to something universal. The Roman arena is one of the film's strongest visual and symbolic spaces, a place where human suffering gets converted into spectacle. Violence there isn't only a means of control but a form of entertainment for the ruling class, creating a powerful image of desensitization where life and death become commodities for public consumption. The arena shows how systems of power can normalize brutality by turning it into ritual. Another key contrast runs between movement and stasis. The enslaved world is portrayed as confined and rigid, while rebellion is tied to movement, travel, expansion. As Spartacus leads the uprising, the story physically sweeps across landscapes, symbolizing an expansion of consciousness and resistance, though that movement ultimately collides with the immovable structure of Rome, underlining the tragic tension between freedom and control. Sacrifice runs through the story as well. Many characters willingly give up safety, freedom, even their lives for the sake of collective identity. The final refusal to identify Spartacus isn't just loyalty to one man, it's a rejection of betrayal as a survival strategy, and the film frames that sacrifice not as senseless loss but as moral affirmation. Visual style and cinematography. Spartacus is defined as much by its visual ambition as by its story and performances, representing one of the most carefully built examples of classical Hollywood cinematography applied to a sprawling historical epic. Its visual style is designed to convey both the grandeur of ancient Rome and the intimate human struggle unfolding within it. Every framing choice, lighting decision, and camera move contributes to a visual language built around scale, hierarchy, and emotional tension. Wide compositions are one of the film's most striking cinematographic tools. The camera regularly captures huge groups of people and scenes of slavery, military formations, or public Roman gatherings, and these shots aren't just for show. They serve the story's themes directly. By placing individuals inside massive architectural or natural spaces, the film visually reinforces how systems of power dwarf the individual. Spartacus himself is frequently shown as a small figure inside enormous frames, particularly in the early quarry and gladiator training scenes, creating a visual metaphor for oppression before a single line of dialogue explains it. The film leans hard on the contrast between confined and open space. Early sequences at the gladiator school use tight framing, heavy stone architecture, and cramped compositions to reflect the characters' psychological and physical imprisonment. As the rebellion takes hold, the cinematography opens up dramatically. Outdoor landscapes, marching armies, and sprawling battlefields dominate the frame, mirroring the shift from captivity to movement and reinforcing the theme of liberation through spatial expansion. Lighting carries a lot of the film's tonal weight. Interior Roman spaces are typically lit with controlled, directional lighting that highlights marble, statues, and rigid architectural lines, building a cold, structured atmosphere tied to Roman authority. Scenes involving the slaves and rebels, by contrast, tend to use softer, more natural light, especially outdoors. A visual split between artificial control and organic human life that communicates ideological opposition even without any dialogue. Depth of field does a lot of quiet work throughout the film. Characters are often positioned at different distances from the camera to create layered compositions that hint at social hierarchy. A Roman elites elevated on balconies, platforms, or thrones, while enslaved characters sit lower in the frame. This vertical arrangement reinforces the rigidity of the world's class structure. The camera isn't just recording action, it's organizing social relationships visually. Camera movement stays largely deliberate and restrained, in keeping with the classical filmmaking style of the era. But when the camera does move, it means something. Slow tracking shots often follow groups of slaves or soldiers, emphasizing collective motion over individual heroics, giving the world a sense of structure and intention rather than chaos. Moments of emotional intensity, by contrast, are sometimes shot with tighter, more intimate framing that draws focus to facial expression and small performance details. The battle sequences represent some of the film's most technically demanding cinematography. Without digital effects to lean on, the filmmakers relied on precise choreography, practical staging, and multiple camera setups. Wide shots establish the geography of the fight, closer shots capture individual moments of struggle, and the editing between the two builds a rhythm that balances spectacle with human experience. Even in the biggest battles, the camera keeps the audience aware of individual suffering amid mass violence. Architecture plays an active role in the film's visual storytelling too. Roman structures are rendered with heavy stone, symmetrical layouts, and monumental scale. Not mere backdrops but active symbols of authority. Columns, arches, and statues dominate the frame, reinforcing themes of permanence and control, and the rigidity of that architecture stands in sharp contrast to the more natural, irregular spaces tied to the rebel forces. Costume choices are woven into the cinematography as well. Roman characters appear in polished, structured environments wearing ornate costumes signaling wealth and authority, while enslaved characters are shown in rougher, more chaotic visual conditions, their worn clothing and physical strain emphasized through lighting and camera angular visual class division that needs no exposition to land. The film also makes deliberate use of scale shifts, cutting between massive crowd shots and intimate close-ups to control emotional engagement. Big shots establish the political or social stakes, close-ups deliver the personal, emotional ones, an alternation that keeps the audience tuned into both the collective and individual dimensions of the story simultaneously. Color follows the Technicolor conventions of the era, producing a rich but restrained palette used to distinguish environments and emotional tone. Earth tones for the outdoor slave settings, marble whites, deep reds, and gold accents for Roman interiors, reinforcing the ideological split between oppression and authority. One of the film's most consistent visual strategies is its use of symmetry and order in Roman scenes. Balanced compositions, geometric alignment, controlled framing, everything deliberate and structured. Scenes tied to rebellion or movement, by contrast, often break that symmetry with irregular compositions and dynamic group arrangements, reinforcing the thematic split between control and freedom. Sound and score. The soundscape of Spartacus is crucial to its emotional weight, narrative rhythm, and epic feel. While the visuals establish Rome's grandeur, the music and sound design carry the emotional undercurrent that guides the audience through oppression, intimacy, rebellion, and tragedy are used not as background dressing but as an active storytelling device that reinforces character arcs and thematic meaning. Composer Alex North's score is central to the film's identity, already known for blending classical orchestration with modern emotional intensity. North built a score that's both expansive and deeply human, balancing sweeping orchestral themes with intimate musical motifs tied to personal struggle. The music doesn't just accompany the scenes, it interprets them, often surfacing emotional layers the dialogue leaves unspoken. Recurring musical themes are one of the score's defining features. Spartacus himself carries a strong, evolving motif that reflects his journey from enslaved laborer to revolutionary leader, a restrained and fragmented early on to reflect his uncertainty and confinement, growing more unified, powerful, and expansive as his leadership develops. That musical evolution tracks his psychological and ideological growth beat for beat. Rome gets its own distinct musical identity too, one built around rigid, formal, structured themes that emphasize order and control through steady rhythms and disciplined orchestration. The contrast between the Roman musical rigidity and the more fluid, emotional themes tied to the slaves reinforces the film's core ideological conflict. Music itself becomes a stand-in for competing power systems, not just individual emotional states. Some of the score's most emotionally resonant moments come during scenes between Spartacus and Varinia, scored with softer, more lyrical compositions that sharply contrast with the surrounding harshness. These passages emphasize intimacy and vulnerability, offering a counterweight to the film's political and violent content and reminding the audience that human connection is possible even inside an oppressive system. The soundtrack does heavy lifting during the battle sequences too, structured carefully to maintain clarity and emotional direction rather than dissolving into pure chaos or percussion. The score alternates between tension and release, keeping the audience emotionally oriented even during scenes of overwhelming violence, organizing chaos into something coherent. Silence itself is used as a deliberate tool. The film often pulls back or drops the music entirely to emphasize emotional gravity, letting the visuals and performances carry scenes of punishment, reflection, or moral decision-making without musical interference, a technique that heightens realism and tension by forcing the audience to sit directly with the imagery and emotion. The gladiatorial arena's sound design is especially notable. The roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, and the ambient chatter of spectators combine into a layered auditory environment that reinforces violence as spectacle. That crowd noise often swells to overwhelming levels, symbolizing a collective appetite for entertainment built on suffering, and deepening the film's moral tension. In scenes of forced labor, Sound emphasizes physical strain as the repetitive noise of tools, chains, and movement forms a rhythmic pattern that reflects the dehumanizing nature of the work, often mixed with low, subdued musical tones that reinforce endurance and oppression. Dialogue is carefully folded into the overall sound design too, because Spartacus leans so heavily on spoken word to express ideology and emotion. Clarity of speech takes priority in the mix, with voices positioned prominently so key thematic lines land clearly even in massive scenes. One of the most famous sound moments in the film is the "I am Spartacus" sequence, not just a visual beat but an auditory one, where the layering of voices builds a rising emotional effect as each declaration stacks on the last. The simplicity of the words combined with the weight of repetition turns plain speech into a symbol of unity and resistance. The score also shapes the film's sense of tragedy. As the rebellion collapses in the final act, the music turns more subdued and melancholic, reflecting loss, inevitability, and endurance rather than leaning into pure dramatic defeat, and helping guide the audience's emotional shift from hope to consequence. North's orchestration throughout is notable for its complexity and depth, a full symphonic arrangement that avoids grandeur for its own sake, using brass to represent authority and power while strings and woodwinds carry the human, emotional themes. Critical and audience reception. When Spartacus premiered, it drew a mix of admiration for its scale and tension around its artistic and political ambitions. The film landed at a moment when Hollywood was still committed to sprawling historical epics, even as audiences and critics were beginning to expect more psychological depth and realism from the genre. Spartacus delivered plenty of spectacle while also pushing against conventional ideas about authorship, storytelling, and political meaning, which meant its reception wasn't uniform, splitting between praise for its ambition and criticism of its length, pacing, and tonal seriousness. Critics widely acknowledged its sheer scale and production value as a major strength. Reviewers recognized it as one of the most expensive and logistically complex productions of its era. The battle sequences, the rebuilt Roman world, and the massive crowd scenes were seen as genuine technical achievements that raised the bar for epic filmmaking, with many critics praising how convincingly the film brought its ancient setting to life, even while taking liberties with historical detail. At the same time, some critics found the pacing uneven as the film runs long and covers a wide historical arc, and certain sections, particularly the early stretches dealing with slavery and gladiator training, struck some viewers as methodical to the point of heaviness. Other critics defended that same pacing, arguing it was necessary to lay the emotional and ideological groundwork for everything that follows. Over time, what once read as slow pacing has often been reassessed as deliberate world-building. The performances drew largely positive reviews, though critics weighted them differently. Kirk Douglas received strong praise for his physical presence and emotional intensity as Spartacus, seen as central to grounding such a massive narrative in one human figure, though some reviewers noted that Spartacus as written functions more as a symbol than a psychologically complex character, sparking debate over whether the film prioritized theme over individual depth. Olivier's Crassus was widely admired for its precision and theatrical command, with critics often calling his scenes some of the most intellectually engaging in the film. Ustinov's performance drew particularly strong praise, with many critics naming it one of the film's highlights for how it balanced humor, cynicism, and moral ambiguity. Praise substantial enough to earn him a major award and cement his reputation as one of cinema's most versatile character actors. Trumbo's screenplay attracted plenty of critical attention too, though its political significance got discussed more within the industry than in mainstream reviews at the time. The fact that Trumbo was credited under his own name was itself treated as a major cultural event, and critics aware of the blacklist context often read the film as a symbolic win for artistic freedom. Others focused less on the politics and more on the screenplay's structure, noting its ambitious scope and, at times, dense dialogue. Audiences generally responded strongly, especially viewers drawn to historical epics and large-scale storytelling. Many were pulled in by the spectacle, emotional intensity, and clear moral stakes, with the themes of rebellion and freedom resonating widely, even if different viewers read them through different cultural or political lenses. Some saw it primarily as an adventure story, others as something deeper about resistance and human dignity. Not every response was glowing, though some viewers found the runtime challenging, and others felt the philosophical and political discussions occasionally slowed the story's momentum, with the balance between action and dialogue sometimes feeling uneven compared to more straightforward adventure epics of the time. Even so, the film's box office success suggests its appeal outweighed those concerns for most audiences. Historical accuracy has been a recurring point of criticism over the years. Scholars and historically minded viewers have pointed out that the film compresses timelines, combines or invents characters, and simplifies political dynamics for dramatic effect. That wasn't unusual for epics of the period, but it's a frequent talking point when discussing Spartacus. Most critics agree the film prioritizes thematic truth over strict historical accuracy, favoring symbolic storytelling over literal reconstruction. Tonal consistency has also come up in critical discussion. The film shifts between intimate drama, philosophical dialogue, political intrigue, and large-scale action, and while some critics saw that range as a strength reflecting the complexity of the subject, others found the transitions occasionally abrupt, giving the film an uneven rhythm. Over time, though, many film scholars have come to view that tonal range as ambition rather than a flaw. Legacy. The influence of Spartacus stretches well beyond its status as a historical epic. It's become a foundational text in film history, shaping filmmaking style, political storytelling on screen, and how large-scale narratives about rebellion and freedom get built. Its fingerprints show up both in direct homages and in broader industry shifts, particularly in how Hollywood approaches epic storytelling, character-driven political drama, and historical adaptation. One of its biggest legacies is helping redefine the historical epic genre itself. Where earlier epics leaned mostly on spectacle, heroic myth, and simplified moral narratives, Spartacus brought a more serious engagement with political structure, class conflict, and ideology, influencing later films that combined visual grandeur with real intellectual or philosophical depth. Lawrence of Arabia, Gladiator, and Braveheart can all be traced back to this model of embedding personal stories inside larger historical and political frameworks. The film also shaped how rebellion gets portrayed on screen more broadly, helping establish the archetype of the reluctant hero who becomes a symbolic leader of collective resistance, a narrative structure that's been reused across countless films, TV shows, and novels since. The idea that one person can come to embody the identity of many, especially during oppression, became a powerful storytelling device, and the "I am Spartacus" moment has been endlessly reinterpreted as one of the most iconic representations of solidarity in popular culture. Beyond narrative influence, Spartacus also had a real impact on industry, politics and production practices. Crediting Dalton Trumbo openly marked a turning point in Hollywood's relationship with the blacklist, helping accelerate the end of an era when political ideology could end a career in the industry. As a result, the film is often discussed not just as a piece of cinema but as a symbolic milestone in restoring artistic freedom to Hollywood. Its influence also shows up in how cinematic scale evolved afterward. Spartacus proved that massive productions could still carry real emotional and thematic depth, and its balance of huge crowd scenes with intimate character moments became a model for later epics. Filmmakers studying the film often point to how it grounds spectacle in genuine human emotion. Its imprint even carries into television and modern streaming, with many serialized historical dramas and political epics drawing on its structure of gradual rebellion, expanding alliances, and eventual confrontation with a dominant power. The approach of building a story across multiple layers of society, from enslaved individuals up to political elites, has become a common technique in long-form visual storytelling. The film's aesthetic influence runs deep too. Its depiction of ancient Rome established a visual language for Roman epics that's persisted for decades. A massive stone architecture, structured military formations, stylized depictions of Roman authority, a recurring visual motifs that later productions still engage with even when trying to revise or modernize their take on Rome. In terms of performance, Spartacus showcased the power of ensemble acting in epic cinema rather than leaning on a single dominant lead, featuring multiple strong performances that build a genuinely layered world. That approach influenced later ensemble-driven historical and political dramas built around multiple character arcs operating simultaneously within one shared historical framework. The film also played a major role in mythologizing the real Spartacus. The historical figure remained fairly obscure in the actual record, but the film shaped how modern audiences understand him. In many ways, the cinematic Spartacus is more recognizable today than the historical one, a good example of how film can reshape historical memory and turn a limited historical record into a universal symbol. Internationally, Spartacus influenced filmmakers working across very different political and cultural contexts. Its themes of rebellion and oppression resonated in countries going through political change, decolonization, or authoritarian rule, making it part of a genuinely global conversation about power and freedom, with filmmakers outside Hollywood drawing on its structure and themes to tell their own stories of resistance. The production also helped cement Stanley Kubrick's reputation as a director capable of handling massive productions, even though he'd later moved toward more personal, stylistically distinct work. Spartacus stands as an important transitional point in his career, a proof he could operate within the constraints of studio filmmaking while still stamping the project with the visual and narrative control that would define his later films. Over the decades, Spartacus has also become a subject of serious academic study across film theory, political theory, and cultural studies. Scholars treat it not just as a historical film but as a text reflecting mid-20th century political anxieties around authority, ideology, and collective identity, and its layered meanings make it a frequent case study in how cinema builds political symbolism. In popular culture, its influence keeps circulating through references, parodies, and reinterpretations. The I Am Spartacus sequence remains one of the most frequently cited moments in film history, showing up in TV comedy, dramatic homages, internet culture, and political commentary, proof that a single scene can outgrow its original context to become a universal cultural symbol. How audiences responded. Audience reactions to Spartacus have always run deeper than simple entertainment value. From its release onward, viewers engaged with it on multiple levels as a historical epic, sure, but also as a story about power, identity, and resistance that mirrored their own social realities. Over time, different generations have reinterpreted the film through the lens of their own political climates, cultural values, and cinematic expectations. For early 1960s audiences, Spartacus arrived amid real global tension and social change. The Cold War, civil rights movements, decolonization struggles, and growing skepticism toward established authority. In that climate, plenty of viewers saw the story of an enslaved man leading a revolt against a powerful empire as more than ancient history. It read as a symbolic reflection of the freedom and equality struggles happening around them, even though the story itself was set in antiquity. One of the strongest emotional responses centered on collective identity. The I Am Spartacus moment landed so powerfully because it tapped into something audiences intuitively understood, that solidarity could outweigh individual self-preservation. Many viewers read the scene as a moral statement about loyalty, courage, and shared humanity, resonating precisely because it defies the instinct to protect oneself first in favor of collective responsibility. Audiences also responded strongly to Spartacus's personal journey. His shift from enslaved laborer to rebellion leader created a sense of gradual empowerment viewers could track and invest in emotionally. Unlike traditional heroes who start the story already holding authority, Spartacus earns his role through suffering, observation, and moral awakening, which made his arc feel accessible and grounded rather than remote. The Spartacus-Verinia relationship shaped audience interpretation too. Many viewers read their bond as a symbol of human connection existing outside systems of control. In a world defined by violence and hierarchy, their relationship represented emotional freedom and personal dignity, offering emotional relief that balanced out the film's heavier political and violent content and giving audiences a more intimate way into the characters. Not every early viewer connected with the pacing, though the film's length and structural complexity challenged some audiences compared to punchier adventure films of the era. Even among those who noted the pacing issues, many still recognized its emotional and thematic power, and repeated viewings often shifted initial reactions, with audiences growing more appreciative of its deliberate build over time. International audiences filtered Spartacus through their own cultural and political circumstances. In countries dealing with political oppression or colonial transition, the film often read as an allegory for resisting imperial control, with Spartacus functioning less as a historical figure and more as a symbol of collective struggle. That interpretive flexibility is a big part of why the film resonated across so many different societies. As time passed, newer generations came to view the film differently. Modern audiences, especially those familiar with later epics and TV series, often see it as a foundational text and are more consciously aware of how it shaped the language of on-screen rebellion narratives. Through they also sometimes notice the gap in pacing, performance style, and production technique compared to contemporary filmmaking, which can create a sense of historical distance. Film enthusiasts and cinephiles often engage with the movie through the lens of its production history. Knowing the screenplay came from Dalton Trumbo in the aftermath of the Hollywood blacklist adds another layer of meaning for many viewers, turning the film into a dual narrative, a story of rebellion on screen paired with a real-world story of artistic resistance behind the camera. The ending draws a particularly rich emotional response. Spartacus's defeat and the crushing of the rebellion tends to read not as a simple tragedy but as a complex emotional resolution. The physical rebellion fails, but the moral victory holds, preserved by the slaves' refusal to betray their leader. Audiences often describe the ending as both heartbreaking and uplifting, since it suggests ideas about freedom survive even when the people carrying them are defeated. Themes of dignity, sacrifice, and collective identity have also pushed many viewers to reflect on their own understanding of moral courage, which is part of why the film keeps coming up in discussions of ethics, leadership, and political responsibility. Across the decades, Spartacus has held onto a strong emotional pull precisely because it supports so many layers of interpretation. As some watch it as pure epic adventure, others as political allegory, others as philosophical reflection on human nature. And that flexibility of meaning is a big part of why it stays relevant across different eras and cultures. Character development. Spartacus builds its characters around transformation under extreme pressure, shaped not by comfort or stability but by oppression, resistance, and the struggle to survive, rather than the traditional arc driven by personal ambition or correcting some internal flaw. The film develops its characters through external forces and moral awakening. Each major figure represents a different response to power, freedom, and control, and together their journeys form the emotional core of the story. Spartacus's arc drives the entire film. At the start, he's no natural-born leader or ideological thinker. He's an enslaved man focused purely on surviving a brutal system, reactive rather than strategic, shaped by endurance and instinct. Repeated exposure to injustice gradually shifts his perspective. There's no single defining moment, just a slow accumulation of awareness as he comes to see that the system enslaving him isn't accidental but deliberately structured. As Spartacus moves from the gladiator school to leading a rebellion, his character shifts from individual survival to collective responsibility, a crucial change that redefines his identity, since he's no longer acting just for himself but for a growing number of people looking to him for direction. Yet the film keeps emphasizing that he doesn't chase power in any conventional sense. He's often reluctant, even uneasy, about being singled out as a leader, which reinforces the film's larger point that leadership here isn't about authority but about representing a shared struggle. His relationship with Varinia adds another dimension to his arc beyond the political rebellion through her. He's shown not only as a revolutionary but as someone capable of love, care, and emotional vulnerability, which humanizes him and keeps him from becoming purely symbolic. Varinia's arc is quieter but no less meaningful. She starts as a captive with little agency, subject to Roman ownership and exploitation, and gradually grows into a figure of emotional strength and moral clarity. Her survival and endurance represent a different form of resistance, not military action, but the preservation of identity and dignity. And by the film's end she embodies continuity and future possibility, especially through her connection to Spartacus's legacy. Crassus follows a contrasting arc, one built around ideological reinforcement rather than personal transformation. He begins and ends the film as a figure who believes fully in the legitimacy of Roman order, though his character does hint at subtler psychological dimensions, especially in his desire for control, visible in his interactions with Antoninus. He never undergoes the kind of moral change Spartacus does. Instead, he embodies the stability and rigidity of institutional power, reinforcing the idea that systems of authority tend to resist transformation. Antoninus offers one of the film's more emotionally layered supporting arcs. Introduced as a young slave seeking freedom and protection, he grows steadily closer to Spartacus, moving from fear and dependence toward a more conscious sense of loyalty and sacrifice, a journey built around chosen identity. By the end, his refusal to betray Spartacus marks a shift from self-preservation to genuine moral commitment, and his arc adds significant emotional weight to the film's climax. Spartacus, the gladiator trainer, follows a more pragmatic and morally ambiguous path, driven by survival within a corrupt system rather than any real ideology. He starts out opportunistic and self-interested, exploiting slaves for profit, but as the rebellion unfolds his behavior reveals adaptability rather than conviction. He shifts allegiances as needed, a character shaped more by systemic pressure than personal morality. His arc shows how people inside oppressive systems often become flexible rather than principled just to survive. Rome's political figures, Crassus and his circle among them, collectively form a structural arc more than an individual one. Their development tracks the escalating threat of the rebellion, and as Spartacus's movement grows, they become increasingly focused on restoring order. An arc defined by reaction rather than change, contrasting the stability of institutional power against the evolving identity of the rebels. One of the film's most important character choices is the contrast between individual transformation and collective change. While Spartacus and a handful of key figures go through clear emotional and ideological shifts, the larger group of enslaved characters evolves together, as a collective body defined by growing awareness, unity, and shared purpose, reinforcing the film's central message that liberation isn't the product of one person alone but of many people recognizing what they have in common. Characters who embrace solidarity tend to move toward emotional clarity and moral strength, while those loyal to systems of domination tend to resist change. Though the film avoids simple moral categories, even characters within the Roman system get real complexity, suggesting that survival inside hierarchical structures often demands compromise rather than pure villainy. Costume and set design. The costume and set design in Spartacus do essential work in establishing the film's historical atmosphere, social hierarchy, and thematic contrast between oppression and authority. Every visual detail, from the texture of a costume to the scale of a building, is built to communicate meaning beyond what's said in dialogue. The design isn't decorative, it functions as its own storytelling system, reinforcing the film's ideas about power, identity, and control. The set design leans heavily on reconstructing ancient Rome and its surrounding landscapes. Roman architecture appears monumental, symmetrical, and heavily structured. Massive stone columns, marble floors, sprawling courtyards, elevated platforms, all built to convey permanence and dominance. The sheer scale of these environments underscores the sense that the Roman system is vast, organized, and nearly impossible to challenge. In contrast, the spaces tied to enslaved characters are visually rougher and more confined. The quarry where Spartacus starts out is rugged, dusty, and oppressive. The gladiator school is built from enclosed stone walls and narrow corridors that emphasize containment. These environments visually reinforce the idea that enslaved people exist inside systems built to limit movement, autonomy, and identity. The contrast between Rome's open spaces and the slaves' confined ones is one of the film's most important visual strategies. The gladiator arena stands out as one of the film's most symbolically loaded set pieces. Built as a circular structure, it works both as a physical space and a symbol of controlled violence. Its design ensures every action is visible to spectators, reinforcing violence as performance. The arena isn't just a battlefield, it's a stage where human life becomes spectacle for political and social entertainment, and that design choice underlines the relationship between power and being watched. Costume design carries just as much weight in establishing identity and hierarchy. Roman elites wear elaborate, structured garments, flowing robes, armor, decorative flourishes that signal wealth and authority, designed with a precision and symmetry that echo the broader theme of Roman order. Enslaved characters, by contrast, wear rough, minimal, worn clothing, typically earth-toned and physically distressed, emphasizing labor and deprivation through texture alone. As the rebellion grows, subtle costume shifts track changing identity. The enslaved characters don't suddenly gain luxury, but their clothing becomes less uniform, hinting at the individuality emerging within the collective movement. Spartacus himself is visually tracked through costume evolution. Early in the film, his clothing is indistinguishable from other enslaved characters, reinforcing his place within the larger oppressed group. As he becomes a leader, his appearance grows gradually more defined while still staying rooted in simplicity, a visual arc from anonymity to symbolic leadership that carefully avoids elevating him too far above the collective, keeping the film's emphasis on shared identity intact. Roman military costumes are highly structured and functional, built around discipline and hierarchy. Armor, helmets, and uniforms designed to project uniform identity across the Roman forces, standing in sharp contrast to the growing individuality among the rebels. This visual design communicates efficiency, organization, and institutional power, reinforcing Rome as a disciplined system rather than a chaotic one. The interior design of Roman political spaces plays its own role in the film's visual storytelling. Senate chambers and elite meeting rooms are packed with marble, statues, and carefully arranged seating that emphasizes hierarchy not just through dialogue but through where characters physically stand or sit relative to one another. The environments themselves become extensions of political power. Lighting design within the sets deepens the thematic contrast further. Roman interiors typically use controlled lighting that highlights architectural symmetry and polished surfaces, building a cold, structured atmosphere tied to institutional authority. Slave environments and outdoor rebel scenes, by contrast, favor more natural, diffuse lighting that emphasizes imperfection, movement, and human presence, reinforcing the ideological gap between structured power and lived human experience. Props get the same attention to detail, designed for historical accuracy and thematic resonance alike. Weapons, chains, tools, and ceremony objects all carry symbolic weight, with chains in particular serving as a recurring visual symbol of control and oppression, present in early scenes to underline the physical reality of slavery, and notably absent later on to symbolize temporary liberation, even as full freedom remains out of reach. The gladiator training school is one of the film's most carefully designed environments, functioning as a hybrid of prison, military camp, and performance prep facility. Its layout built around control, discipline, and repetition. The training areas are arranged to maximize visibility and oversight, reinforcing the idea that even physical development is monitored and exploited within this system. As the rebellion expands, the sets shift toward more natural, open environments, forests, open fields, rural landscapes symbolizing freedom of movement and the expansion of collective identity. Even so, the looming presence of Roman architecture and military forces in these scenes keeps reminding the audience that freedom here is temporary and constantly under threat. The screenplay. Dalton Trumbo's screenplay is one of the most important foundations of the film, blending classical epic structure with politically charged dialogue, philosophical reflection, and carefully built character exchanges. Unlike many historical epics of its time that leaned heavily on exposition and spectacle, Spartacus uses dialogue as a tool for ideological expression and emotional development. The script functions as more than just connective tissue between scenes, carrying symbolic weight of its own. One of its most distinctive features is the balance it strikes between formal, rhetorical language and grounded, human speech. Roman characters, particularly those in positions of authority, tend to speak in controlled, measured sentences reflecting their political power and social status. A precise, institutional speech that creates real distance between Roman elites and enslaved characters, reinforcing the film's broader theme of systemic hierarchy. Enslaved characters, by contrast, speak more directly and emotionally. Early on their dialogue is sparse, reflecting their lack of agency, but as the rebellion builds, their speech grows more expressive and unified. Spartacus's own speech evolves in step with his character, moving from brief, observational responses to more declarative, motivational language as he steps into leadership. The screenplay is particularly strong in how it handles ideological dialogue, letting Roman authority figures and rebel leaders each articulate their worldview clearly, without collapsing into simple caricature. Crassus, for instance, repeatedly voices a belief in order, hierarchy, and control, framing Roman society as necessary and civilized, a worldview where stability justifies dominance. Spartacus, by contrast, develops a language centered on collective identity, freedom, and shared humanity. One of the script's real strengths is how it uses dialogue to build philosophical tension rather than just move the plot forward. Plenty of conversations revolve around ideas rather than action, with characters debating and challenging concepts of ownership, freedom, and morality. That gives the film a reflective quality that sets it apart from more purely action-driven epics. Even in tense or violent scenes, dialogue often pauses to explore the meaning behind an action rather than simply narrating it. The script also makes strategic use of silence and minimal dialogue. In several key emotional or morally weighty scenes, dialogue drops out almost entirely, letting the visuals and performances carry the moment. And when dialogue does return in these scenes, it's usually concise and pointed, favoring restraint over elaboration. The famous I am Spartacus sequence is one of the clearest examples of how simple dialogue can carry enormous symbolic weight. The line itself is plain, but its repetition transforms it into a statement of collective identity and moral solidarity, building emotional intensity through cumulative effect until the moment outgrows any single character speaking it. The screenplay's pacing shows through in how dialogue is distributed across the film. Early sections favor longer conversations that build the world, establish social structure, and develop character relationships. As the rebellion progresses, the dialogue grows more fragmented and action-driven, reflecting rising urgency, and in the final act, the film often relies on short, decisive lines rather than extended conversation to carry its emotional weight. Rhetorical contrast is another important tool in the script. Roman dialogue tends to emphasize permanence, law, and order, while rebel dialogue leans toward movement, change, and collective action. A contrast that's linguistic as much as thematic, embedding ideology directly into how each side talks. Beatrice supplies some of the screenplay's most flexible and tonally varied dialogue, blending humor, cynicism, and pragmatism to create moments of levity within an otherwise serious story. His speech reflects survival inside a corrupt system, where adaptability matters more than principle, and introduces a linguistic tone distinct from both Roman formality and rebel idealism. The script also uses dialogue to explore emotional relationships more subtly. Conversations between Spartacus and Varinia tend to be quieter and more intimate than the political or military discussions swirling around them, focused less on ideology and more on human connection, trust, and emotional grounding, a contrast that helps balance the film's larger thematic structure. One of Trumbo's real strengths as a writer is keeping the dialogue clear and accessible even as the story handles political structures, military strategy, and philosophical ideas across a huge, sprawling narrative. That clarity lets the audience track both the emotional and ideological threads without getting lost, even as the story moves through multiple layers of society. Marketing and promotion. The marketing behind Spartacus reflected both the scale of the production and the changing nature of Hollywood publicity in the late studio era. As one of the most expensive and ambitious films of its time, Spartacus was positioned not just as a movie release but as a major cultural event, with Universal Pictures pouring resources into promoting its scope, star power, and historical spectacle, while carefully navigating the political and industry significance surrounding its production. Scale and spectacle sat at the center of the campaign. Promotional materials highlighted the massive battle sequences, the rebuilt Roman world, and the huge ensemble cast, with posters and ads leaning on dramatic imagery of gladiators, soldiers, and vast crowds. The messaging was clear. Spartacus wasn't a small or intimate picture but a monumental cinematic experience meant for the biggest screen possible. Star power was another major pillar of the promotion. Kirk Douglas anchored the marketing, appearing prominently across posters and press materials, with his established reputation helping pull in mainstream audiences. Alongside him, the marketing highlighted Laurence Olivier, Gene Simmons, Tony Curtis, and Peter Ustinov to emphasize the strength of the ensemble, a lineup of major stars designed to signal that this was a prestige, must-see event. The campaign also carefully framed Spartacus as a serious historical epic rather than pure action spectacle. Trailers and promotional copy emphasized freedom, rebellion, and human struggle, distinguishing it from the more formulaic sword and sandal films of the time and aiming to draw both casual moviegoers and the more serious film audiences. One of the more unusual wrinkles in the promotion was what couldn't be openly emphasized at the time: the political weight behind the screenplay's authorship. Dalton Trumbo, who wrote the script, had previously been blacklisted during the McCarthy era, and Spartacus became one of the first major studio films to credit him under his real name. Even though that was a historic moment for the industry, the marketing had to tread carefully given lingering political sensitivities in Hollywood, so the promotional focus stayed on the story, cast, and spectacle rather than explicitly on its political authorship. Press coverage helped build anticipation ahead of release, with magazines and newspapers regularly focusing on the production's scale, the complexity of the shoot, and the collaboration among major Hollywood figures. Behind-the-scenes stories about the massive sets, thousands of extras, and logistical hurdles fed public curiosity, and the narrative of Spartacus as a difficult but ultimately triumphant production became part of its own promotional identity. The trailers themselves were built for dramatic intensity and emotional stakes rather than plot reveals, favoring key visual moments like gladiator combat, Roman political gatherings, and large-scale battles, paced to build excitement while keeping some mystery intact. Orchestral music in the promotional materials reinforced the film's epic tone as well. International promotion varied by market, but the core themes of rebellion and spectacle stayed consistent everywhere. In many countries, the marketing emphasized the story's universal quality over its specific historical setting, allowing the film to be sold as a timeless narrative of freedom and resistance accessible to audiences across very different cultural backgrounds. The release strategy matched the film's status as a major studio investment, a wide theatrical release backed by heavy promotion in major urban markets. Given its length and scale, screenings were often positioned as special cinematic events rather than routine entertainment, which helped elevate the film's status and draw in audiences who might not typically seek out historical epics. Word of mouth played a real role in sustaining the film's success after release, with impressed audiences recommending it widely and helping keep box office numbers strong over time. The combination of critical attention, promotional visibility, and audience buzz kept the film culturally present well past its initial run. The film's promotional legacy has also shifted over time. Early marketing leaned mostly on spectacle and star power, but later re-releases and retrospectives have emphasized its political significance, particularly its ties to the Hollywood blacklist and Trumbo's screen credit. These days, Spartacus tends to get promoted not just as an epic film but as a genuine landmark in cinematic and cultural history. Merchandising was fairly modest by modern blockbuster standards, but the film's imagery became iconic in its own right. Posters, lobby cards, and promotional stills of Spartacus in gladiator gear or Roman arenas became lasting visual references that helped shape public perception of the film and cemented its long-term cultural recognition. How Spartacus compares to other epics. Spartacus occupies a unique spot in film history, sitting right at the intersection of classical Hollywood epics and the emerging era of more psychologically and politically complex cinema. Looking at it alongside earlier, contemporary, and later films shows how it both honors established traditions and breaks from them, functioning as a kind of transitional model for historical storytelling on screen. Set beside earlier Hollywood epics like Ben-Hur, 1959, Spartacus shares plenty of structural DNA, a large-scale production design, historical settings, and stories of individuals struggling against vast systems of power. Both films lean on spectacle, with massive sets, elaborate costumes, and crowd scenes built to convey the grandeur of ancient civilizations. But the tone and ideological focus diverge sharply. Where Ben-Hur centers on personal redemption and spiritual transformation, Spartacus is explicitly about political rebellion and collective identity, prioritizing group solidarity and resistance to systemic oppression over individual salvation. Quo Vadis, 1951, another earlier Roman epic depicting conflict between early Christians and Roman authority, offers another useful comparison. That film centers largely on religious faith and personal virtue within a corrupt empire, while Spartacus strips out the religious framework almost entirely and replaces it with a secular political struggle. The conflict isn't divine versus pagan but oppressed versus oppressor, reflecting a broader shift in storytelling away from moral allegory and toward social and political commentary. Compared to its contemporaries in the sword and sandal genre, Spartacus stands apart even more clearly. Many films from the same period focused mainly on action, mythological heroism, or simplified history, prioritizing spectacle over ideological depth. Spartacus, while still delivering plenty of large-scale action, puts far more weight on political structure, philosophical dialogue, and character psychology, treating its subject with a seriousness that lifts it above typical genre expectations. Within Stanley Kubrick's own filmography, Spartacus holds an unusual position compared to later work like 2001, A Space Odyssey or A Clockwork Orange. It's far more constrained by studio expectations and genre conventions. Kubrick's visual precision is there, but filtered through the demands of a large studio production rather than a fully independent artistic vision. That makes Spartacus a transitional work in his career, bridging his early Hollywood period with the era of total creative control that would define his later films. Set against a later epic like Gladiator, 2000, Spartacus's influence becomes even clearer. Gladiator echoes much of its narrative and thematic DNA, including a slave or soldier figure who rises as a symbol of resistance against Roman authority, and both films lean on gladiatorial combat, Roman political corruption, and personal loss as central story elements. But Gladiator leans more toward individual revenge and emotional closure, while Spartacus stays focused on collective rebellion and unresolved historical consequence. Its tone runs more tragic and ideological, where Gladiator is more personal and cathartic. Braveheart, 1995, offers another useful comparison. Both films center on a charismatic leader inspiring collective resistance against a dominant power. Both lean on themes of freedom, sacrifice, and identity. But Braveheart frames its story around national identity and personal vengeance, while Spartacus operates on a broader social and philosophical plane. The rebellion in Spartacus isn't tied to a single nation or cultural identity but to the universal condition of slavery and oppression. Set alongside modern television, including Rome and the Spartacus TV series, the 1960 film reads as a stylistic and thematic foundation. Later adaptations expand on character relationships, political intrigue, and graphic realism, but they still draw on the basic narrative structure and symbolic framework the original film laid down. The idea of Rome as a system of power and spectacle, with the slave rebellion as the central narrative engine, traces directly back to Spartacus. It's also worth comparing Spartacus to films built around collective identity and political solidarity more broadly. Unlike most traditional hero narratives dominated by a single protagonist, Spartacus spreads its emotional and ideological weight across multiple characters, putting it closer in structure to ensemble political dramas than to conventional hero-driven epics, an influence visible in later films where leadership is shared, contested, or symbolically transferred rather than locked to one individual. Thematically, Spartacus also breaks from most earlier Hollywood epics in how it treats power. Many classical films present power as either legitimate authority or a corrupt deviation from a moral order. Spartacus instead presents power as a systemic structure operating independently of individual morality, a more modern, structural view of authority that set it apart from its predecessors and helped chart a new course for the genre that followed.